The night air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the kind of smell that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. I knelt in the center of the cypress grove, my hands tracing the contours of the dolls we had prepared, small, delicate figures carved from wood and wrapped in fabrics soaked with herbs and oils. Miriam mirrored my movements across the altar, her fingers brushing the charms and amulets that would draw the spirits we needed into this world. Each item, each doll, each whispered word carried centuries of knowledge, a lineage of pain and resistance passed from mother to daughter, from aunt to niece, across oceans and generations. This was no ordinary ritual. We were summoning the weight of history itself, the memories of those whose lives had been crushed and erased, to bend the forces of the universe toward a single purpose: justice. I inhaled deeply, tasting the resin of burning sage and the sharp tang of iron filings scattered around the altar. Every detail mattered. The dolls had to be positioned just so, their eyes aligned with the cardinal points, their limbs placed to mirror the dance of the ancestors. We had learned these configurations in whispers and half-forgotten songs, in texts passed secretly, and in teachings preserved despite the relentless effort to erase our culture. Louisiana had changed the forms, but not the essence. The spirits we called were the same that had walked the African continent long before the Middle Passage had carried our people into bondage. I felt their presence already, a subtle vibration in the soles of my feet, as if the grove itself had been waiting for us to awaken what lay dormant beneath the moss-covered soil. Miriam leaned closer, her voice a soft thread weaving through the night. "Are you ready?" she asked. Her eyes shone with the reflection of the candle flames, green and amber dancing in her dark irises. I nodded, though words felt inadequate for the gravity of what we were about to do. She had always been the more intuitive, the one whose connection to the unseen was immediate, visceral. I had to follow her lead, trusting the wisdom of her spirit as much as I trusted the ritual itself. Together, we began the invocations, our voices rising in a harmony that felt both familiar and alien, phrases in African dialects, Creole French, and the ancient tongues that had survived the crossing, phrases that no one outside our community would understand, yet each word thrummed with power. The first syllables rolled from our mouths like the soft drumbeats of a distant memory, setting the air around us quivering. I felt it immediately, a shift in temperature, subtle at first, a creeping chill that made my breath fog in the candlelight. The candles flickered, though no breeze stirred, and the shadows cast by the cypress trees seemed to lengthen unnaturally, reaching toward us as if drawn by the incantations. It was as though the grove recognized our intent and began to respond, aligning with the energy we summoned. Miriam's movements were precise, every gesture a mirror of the rhythms encoded in our minds and hearts, and I followed her, though my body shook with anticipation and fear. We were alone in the grove, yet we were not. The air hummed with presence, and I sensed the eyes of ancestors upon us, observing, guiding, judging. I picked up the first doll, a small figure wrapped in black cloth, with beads woven into its torso to represent those who had perished before their time. I whispered its purpose aloud, calling the spirits of those whose blood had stained the soil of Louisiana's plantations, whose voices had been silenced by cruel masters. Each word I spoke felt like a spark, igniting threads of power that extended beyond the grove, beyond the plantation, into realms unseen by the human eye. The dolls became conduits, vessels through which the rage, sorrow, and longing of generations could flow, coalescing into an energy so dense that the ground beneath my knees seemed to pulse with life. Miriam's dolls mirrored mine, and soon the grove resonated with a harmony of intent, our combined wills forming a lattice that could not be broken. As we moved into the rhythm of the ceremony, our chanting grew louder, voices weaving together in patterns that defied linear understanding. I could feel the air condensing around us, heavier, charged with the tension of centuries of injustice. The candles burned brighter, their flames bending as if to listen, the scent of herbs and burning oils thickening to the point that it felt like we were inhaling the very history of our people. I glanced at Miriam, and she nodded, sensing the rising intensity. We danced around the altar, the dolls held aloft or laid carefully on the sacred cloth, our feet tracing the patterns our ancestors had worn into the memory of the earth itself. Every step, every word, every gesture was both offering and invocation, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between what was lost and what could now be reclaimed. Then came the first tangible sign of the spirit's response. The temperature dropped suddenly, unnaturally, our breaths forming clouds in the mild December night. The ground seemed to shiver beneath us, moss trembling as if the earth itself recognized the call. Small lights flickered among the trees, moving independently, darting like living creatures too quick to focus on. I felt their gaze, unseen yet insistent, the awareness of forces older than the plantation, older than the state, older even than the white men who thought themselves masters of life and death. My hands shook as I lifted another doll, this one representing the children taken from mothers, their laughter stolen, their lives ended before they had begun. The spirits answered with a chorus of whispers, not words, not yet, but vibrations that ran along my skin, deep into my bones, urging me forward. Miriam stepped closer, our movements synchronized, our voices merging into a singular resonance. I realized then that we were more than ourselves. We were the instruments through which centuries of pain, endurance, and wisdom flowed. I felt the grove leaning into us, the trees bending as if to shelter or witness, the moss rising in tiny waves along the ground. Every syllable we spoke carried weight, a signal to the forces waiting beyond the veil. I understood in that instant that nothing mundane could intervene now. This was the domain of the spirits, and we were merely conduits, vessels chosen for the purpose of making justice manifest. My heart pounded, both terrified and exhilarated, as I felt the presence grow stronger, a pressure that made the hair on my arms stand on end, a force that could not be resisted, only channeled. By the time we completed the initial invocations, the grove had transformed. Shadows moved with intent, candle flames bent toward invisible eyes, and the air vibrated with expectation. The dolls lay in their designated places, channels of power poised to draw down the full weight of ancestral wrath. Miriam and I paused, catching our breaths, but the energy remained, coiling around us like living smoke, waiting for the next phase. I felt the voices of the past brushing against my mind, whispers of guidance, murmurs of vengeance, promises of cosmic balance. The ceremony was only beginning, yet already I knew that nothing in Claude Beaumont's world or any world ruled by men like him would remain unchanged after this night. We exchanged a glance, silent confirmation of our readiness. The air around us throbbed with anticipation, a tangible presence that seemed to press against the very boundaries of reality. I could feel the spirits gathering, the energy of centuries of suffering ready to surge through us, to manifest in ways no human law could prevent, to exact the reckoning that had been deferred for too long. I tightened my grip on the dolls, feeling the warmth of the oils, the weight of the beads, the significance of each carefully chosen symbol. This was our inheritance, our weapon, our covenant with those who had come before. And as the grove seemed to breathe with life of its own, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The grove pulsed with a life of its own, shadows stretching unnaturally across the moss-covered ground as Miriam and I began to move in tandem, feet gliding, stomping, and pivoting in the intricate rhythms that had been etched into our memory from generations past. Each movement resonated with the dolls laid upon the altar, the energy we had summoned flowing outward, forming a latticework of invisible currents that hummed through the night air. Our voices rose in harmony, chanting in the tongues of our ancestors, syllables vibrating with the accumulated rage, grief, and wisdom of those who had suffered under the yoke of oppression. I felt it in my chest, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe normally, as though the grove itself had become a resonating chamber for cosmic justice, amplifying every sound, every whisper, every heartbeat. The first tangible response came almost immediately. A cold wind swept through the cypress, though no storm had gathered and the air was otherwise still. Leaves rustled in unnatural patterns, spiraling upward as if caught by invisible hands. My breath formed visible clouds that mingled with the mist curling along the ground. The dolls, though inanimate, vibrated under my fingertips, a subtle tremor that spoke of the life force now channeling through them. I glanced at Miriam, her face alight with focus, her eyes reflecting the candle flames that flickered in defiance of the darkness. "It's begun," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rising chorus of our chant. As we danced, I felt the grove bend around us. Shadows no longer clung to the edges of trees but moved independently, slithering along the ground, coiling around the trunks, as though alive. Lights flickered in the periphery, not from any earthly source, small orbs that darted between branches and danced above the altar, responding to our summons. The temperature dropped further, the mild December night turning into a biting frost that made my knees ache on the damp earth. Every exhalation came out in thick clouds, carrying the scent of earth, herbs, and something older, something primordial that made my heart pound with both fear and exhilaration. I could sense Claude Beaumont at that very moment, though miles separated us across the plantation. The ritual had opened a channel that connected our world to his, a conduit through which the accumulated weight of our ancestors' wrath would reach him. Already, I could feel his presence, a heavy, trembling aura of guilt and terror radiating across the grounds, permeating the physical space we occupied in ways I could feel deep in my bones. He could not yet see us, could not yet comprehend what was coming, but the spirits were moving toward him, gathering strength, circling him in anticipation. Every step we took, every chant we uttered, pulled that energy closer, concentrating it into a force that would not be denied. Miriam's movements became more frenzied, a whirlwind of precise motions that mirrored mine. Together, we formed a spiral of motion, the dolls on the altar vibrating violently as if attempting to leap from their bindings. The energy surged between us, a tangible current that made my hair stand on end and sent a shiver racing down my spine. I felt the spirits moving through my veins, their presence both terrifying and exhilarating, as if I were no longer my own person but a vessel through which the justice of centuries flowed. I could hear their whispers now, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in a far-off grove, but growing louder, more insistent, as though they were converging on a single purpose, this retribution for the sins of Claude Beaumont and all who had lived by his cruelty. Then came the first unmistakable sign of supernatural manifestation visible to the human eye. Shadows on the perimeter of the grove began to coalesce, forming shapes vaguely humanoid yet impossibly distorted, limbs bending at unnatural angles, faces flickering with expressions of rage and sorrow. Candles burned brighter, their flames stretching toward these apparitions, which moved with deliberate, calculated motion, responding to the summons in ways no ordinary living being could replicate. My hands shook as I raised another doll, this one representing the women whose pregnancies he had ended, the children whose lives were snuffed out before they began. I felt the energy ripple outward, a pulse that seemed to reverberate through the very soil, and the shadows quivered, acknowledging the invocation. The grove became alive with sound as well as movement. The wind carried voices, whispers layered upon whispers, languages both recognizable and foreign, some African, some Creole, others older than any human civilization. They spoke of injustice, of vengeance, of the need to balance scales that earthly law had failed to touch. I shivered, feeling the weight of the history pressing down on me, a responsibility greater than my own body could hold. Miriam mirrored my terror and excitement, her feet moving faster, chanting louder, her body bending and spinning with a grace that seemed superhuman. We were no longer dancers, we were conduits, each step a declaration, each syllable a command. Far across the plantation, I knew Beaumont's study was beginning to respond. Mirrors would soon shatter, candles would flare, casting impossible shadows. His mind, clouded for decades by arrogance and self-deception, would soon be forced to reckon with the lives he had destroyed. I could feel the first tremors of his fear, a prickling sensation in my consciousness as the spirits gathered their strength, focusing it like a blade aimed at the heart of the man who had caused so much suffering. And still we danced, still we chanted, raising our voices in a crescendo that made the very air pulse with energy, a living testament to centuries of pain, survival, and undying resistance. Then came the most unsettling sight of all. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, forming an unnatural canopy above us, branches curling like the hands of the dead reaching for the living. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the moss-covered ground despite the season. Our breaths emerged in thick clouds, and I could see the faint glimmer of the spirits beginning to take shape, faces emerging from the shadows, eyes glowing faintly, lips moving as if chanting alongside us. Each figure bore the weight of a life stolen, of suffering endured, and the intent behind their gaze was unmistakable. They were waiting for Beaumont. They were waiting for justice. I lifted the final doll, the one representing Celeste, his wife, whose life he had chosen to end rather than face the truth of her child and heritage. The moment my fingers brushed the cloth and beads, the grove seemed to convulse, the wind howling through the cypress, the candle flames bending toward the sky. Miriam screamed the final syllables of the invocation, her voice raw with power, and the spirits responded with a resonance that shook the ground beneath us. I felt their presence fully now, a tide of cosmic force building to a peak, a collective will of centuries that had waited patiently, biding its time, and now surged through us, demanding recognition. I caught sight of the lights moving through the trees, small, sentient orbs of energy that darted and swirled, responding to the rhythm of our chants, converging into a column that stretched above the altar. I realized then that the ritual had fully awakened. The dolls were no longer symbols, they were vessels, conduits for power that defied mortal comprehension. Our dancing had become a language, Our voices a command, and the spirits had answered. Claude Beaumont, miles away in his study, would soon understand that the reckoning we invoked was absolute, unstoppable, and immediate. There would be no negotiation, no delayed justice. The cosmic forces we had called were now in motion, their focus unwavering. By the time the first hour of the ritual had passed, we were drenched in sweat despite the cold, bodies trembling from exertion and the overwhelming power flowing through us. Yet I could not stop. Miriam could not stop. The grove had become a theater of the impossible, alive with energy, shadows, lights, and voices, all converging toward a single point across the plantation where a man's crimes would finally be accounted for. I felt the spirits brushing against my skin, their whispers brushing my ears, guiding my steps, telling me to move faster, speak louder, call stronger. I obeyed, every nerve in my body alive with purpose, every thought focused on the inevitable culmination that would follow from this sustained, concentrated act of spiritual warfare. As the twins' dance reached a fevered pitch, the final understanding settled in me. We were not merely performing a ritual, we were conducting a symphony of justice, a coordinated assault on the very soul of a man whose crimes had defied earthly punishment. Each movement, each word, each beat of our hearts was a drum, echoing across realms, summoning forces that would ensure that Claude Beaumont could no longer hide behind wealth, social standing, or self-deception. The ritual had begun in earnest. There was no turning back. I could feel it before I even saw it, the air thickening, heavy with a presence that made my skin crawl, every nerve in my body on high alert. I had been alone in my study, as I always preferred, surrounded by the comfort of mahogany shelves lined with books and ledgers, a fire burning gently in the hearth. Yet tonight, nothing offered solace. The temperature plummeted, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep directly into my bones. My breath came in thick clouds despite the mild Louisiana winter outside, curling before my face like ghostly serpents. The familiar scent of paper and wood was replaced by a metallic tang, like blood, mixed with the damp earth of a graveyard. Something was coming, something older and far more powerful than any earthly adversary I had ever encountered. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of my eye, shadows stretching where they should not have, a cold draft that moved contrary to the pattern of the room. I dismissed it, though my stomach twisted with unease. I had always relied on logic, on reason, on the control my wealth and status afforded me. Yet there was no ledger to balance this. No calculated plan could account for what I now felt pressing against the boundaries of my reality. The mirrors along the walls trembled faintly, reflecting my own image. Yet for a moment I thought I saw faces I had tried to bury in memory. Women who had disappeared from the fields, children whose cries I had silenced before they could reach my ears, and most haunting of all, Celeste, my wife, whose death I had orchestrated with cold precision. Then the first explosion came. Every mirror shattered simultaneously, glass flying in jagged shards that reflected not only my panic, but the innumerable faces of those I had wronged. Their eyes pierced me from every fragment, some filled with sorrow, others with anger so pure it made my knees buckle. The sound was deafening, a chorus of breaking crystal accompanied by voices that spoke in languages I could somehow understand. Even though my mind had never learned them, Claude, they hissed, whispered, screamed sometimes all at once. The cadence of their words seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the inexorable force of judgment that no earthly court could replicate. The candles, too, responded. Flames flared unnaturally high, casting light that should not have existed alongside the shadows, illuminating some corners while leaving others in absolute darkness. The room itself seemed alive, walls pulsating with a malevolent rhythm, the air so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. Shadows moved independently, twisting and curling with intentions of their own, stretching toward me as if to wrap around my body, to constrict and consume. I fell to my knees, hands shaking, desperately attempting to rationalize, to explain away the impossible, but logic fled, leaving only a primal terror that made my heart hammer as though it might burst. Celeste appeared first, stepping out of the darkened corner with a grace that belied the horror of her presence. Her beautiful face, marred by the poison that had ended her life, glowed faintly in the spectral light, eyes deep pools of sorrow and accusation. "You see us now, Claude," she said, her voice resonant and commanding, carrying the weight of every soul I had destroyed. Her words were no longer confined to sound. They reverberated through the room, through the very fibers of my being, pressing against my mind like iron bands. I tried to speak, to offer excuses, but no words would come, only a choking dread that left me gasping on the floor. Behind her came others, women whose only crime had been to carry children that might challenge my social standing, field hands who dared resist my authority, now standing as spectral witnesses, their eyes burning with silent fury. And then the children, small, fragile forms, their deaths ordered with cold calculation, not in anger, but as premeditated measures to protect my reputation and fortune. I could feel their presence, the weight of their innocence, pressing against me with unbearable intensity. Their voices joined in a chorus, a wordless demand for justice that vibrated through the walls, through the floors, through my very soul. The temperature continued its relentless decline. Ice formed along the windows, frost spreading like veins across the glass, even as the fire in the hearth burned more fiercely than ever. Every breath I drew formed thick clouds, swirling in the unnatural currents that now filled the room. The air carried the scent of graveyard earth mingled with the faint sweetness of flowers that bloomed only in cemeteries, a perfume that reminded me of death and decay. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the shadows stretching and bending toward me, surrounding me, whispering accusations I could neither deny nor escape. I attempted to flee, crawling toward the door, but the room itself seemed to expand, shifting in ways that made every distance longer, every step heavier. My limbs felt leaden, my mind clouded with terror. The spirits did not speak only with words. They spoke with sensation, pressing their grievances into my consciousness, forcing me to relive every atrocity I had committed. Each memory was magnified, every act of violence, every termination of life, every calculated murder laid bare, stripped of my rationalizations and justifications. I could see their faces, hear their cries, feel the impact of my actions as though I were living each moment again, powerless to intervene, powerless to escape. Celeste moved closer, her gaze unwavering, piercing through the layers of my fear. "You see all of us," she repeated, her voice now a chorus of the dead, every tone carrying the authority of one who had passed beyond mortal concerns. "Every soul whose blood you spilled, every life you ended, to protect your precious reputation, every crime you committed, to maintain the illusion of order. We have waited, Claude. We have called to the ancestors, and now justice comes." The mirrors continued to shatter in rhythmic bursts, fragments embedding themselves into the walls and floor, as though the room were consuming its own reflections. Flames danced in defiance of light, casting impossible shadows that stretched into corners the human eye could not perceive. The spirits grew bolder, their forms more distinct, some hovering near, others looming from the shadows above. I could no longer distinguish between hallucination and reality. Every sensation pressed upon me with the certainty of truth. My body trembled uncontrollably as the weight of cosmic judgment bore down, pressing me into the ground, forcing me to confront the entirety of my crimes. I tried to bargain, to plead, promising freedom for the enslaved, offering my fortune, swearing to dedicate the remainder of my life to reparations. My words sounded hollow even to me, inadequate against the amassed will of those I had wronged. The spirits did not waver, they did not hesitate. Their demands were absolute. The debts I had accumulated could not be repaid in gold or deeds, only through the immediate, undeniable settlement of my life and power. My body convulsed as energy flowed through me, an electric pulse that burned and chilled simultaneously, every nerve ending aflame. I screamed, voice raw and broken, yet the spirits' voices overpowered mine, a unified force of accusation and inevitability. Celeste's gaze fixed on me, unwavering, her eyes pools of judgment. "Every drop of innocent blood you spilled cries out for balance," she intoned. "Every child who died by your hand stands witness tonight. Every woman who suffered your violence demands payment in the only currency the cosmos recognizes, your life force, extracted slowly, painfully, as settlement for the decades of cruelty you justified with hatred and greed." The room pulsed with her words, the walls vibrating in response, shadows recoiling and lunging in rhythm with her voice. I felt my strength failing, my body no longer my own, seized by forces that had waited generations to correct the imbalance I had perpetuated. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. The passage of time had lost meaning. The spirits continued their assault, relentless, unyielding. My mind fragmented under the combined weight of fear, guilt, and supernatural pressure. The fire burned without warmth. The air was thick with frost and the scent of death, and the apparitions pressed ever closer, each accusing glance, each whispered demand a blade to my soul. I felt the last vestiges of control slip away, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, entirely at the mercy of forces that operated on principles I could never hope to comprehend or resist. When the final moments arrived, I understood only that death had come not as a release, but as the fulfillment of cosmic justice. My body went limp, heart finally ceasing its frantic hammering, mind broken under the unrelenting judgment of those I had wronged. Even in the silence that followed, there was no relief, only the faint hum of power lingering, the grove miles away still resonating with the echoes of our dance, our chants, our invocation of vengeance that could not be undone. I did not witness the events at Rienzi directly, but the shockwaves reached every corner of the plantation the moment Émile Boudreau, the overseer, discovered Master Claude Beaumont slumped over his mahogany desk on the morning of December 22nd, 1851. Émile's cries echoed through the halls, mingling with the winter wind as he staggered toward the front veranda, each step punctuated by disbelief. The man's face, usually composed and authoritative, was drained of color, his eyes wide with horror. He stumbled into the servants' quarters, calling for anyone who could hear him. My ears picked up fragments of his frantic words, the terror in his tone so palpable that it seemed to cling to the walls themselves. He's dead. The master, He could not finish the sentence. His mind, already burdened by years of managing both the plantation and its people, could not accommodate the unnatural scene before him. The body of Beaumont was a grotesque testament to the forces that had overtaken him. Émile's first impression was that of natural death, perhaps a heart attack brought on by stress or illness. But as he approached, he noticed details that defied every law of medicine and reason. His wrists and ankles bore marks resembling rope burns, yet no restraints had been used. His eyes were frozen wide in terror, staring past the physical confines of the room, focused on some invisible presence that the living could not perceive. Most disturbing of all, his mouth was packed with red Louisiana clay, inexplicably brought to the second-floor study from some unknown source. Émile stumbled back, recoiling as though the room itself had turned against him. He knew immediately that what had occurred was far beyond human comprehension. Word of Beaumont's death spread quickly among the enslaved population, carried along the back roads, through fields and whispered in the quarters. The air buzzed with a mix of fear and awe. Those who had witnessed the twins' rituals, the strange phenomena at the grove, spoke in hushed tones, recounting every detail they had seen. The chilling cold, the lights moving among the trees, the harmonies that seemed to summon unseen entities. Selah and Miriam had become figures of legend overnight, symbols of power and protection, capable of invoking forces that could reach even the most fortified white man. Their success sparked conversations that ranged from reverence to worry. Elders warned of unintended consequences, recalling prior instances of resistance that had ended in brutal reprisals. Yet the younger enslaved people could not hide their excitement. Their belief that justice long denied had finally been realized. Émile, though loyal to the Beaumont family, was forced into a position of delicate mediation. He needed to secure the estate, ensure that the remaining enslaved laborers remained productive, and yet he could not dismiss the supernatural elements that had evidently led to Master Claude's demise. The plantation was a tinderbox of rumor, speculation, and fear, and Émile had to act decisively to prevent panic from spreading. He secured the study, noting every detail of the scene, while silently praying that whatever had been unleashed would not turn its attention toward him. The silence that fell over the house was thick, oppressive, carrying the weight of lives forever changed, and justice served in ways that defied human laws. The broader consequences reached beyond Rienzi. Local planters and white authorities began to murmur about the death of Claude Beaumont in ways that reflected both fear and fascination. Rumors spread of a divine reckoning, of ghosts and spirits exacting vengeance for crimes that human courts had ignored. The network of Louisiana plantations, tightly interconnected through business dealings, marriage alliances, and social obligations, was suddenly forced to confront the unsettling notion that enslaved people could exercise agency in ways that transcended conventional control. The idea that spiritual forces, summoned and directed by those they oppressed, could bring a master to his knees challenged every assumption that had held their society together. At the same time, the estate itself became a complex problem for Claude's surviving relatives, particularly his cousin Etienne Beaumont. A more pragmatic man, Etienne arrived within a week, accompanied by lawyers, accountants, and spiritual advisors. His task was unprecedented: to evaluate the plantation's financial viability, the legal disposition of nearly 500 enslaved people, and the very real supernatural risks that accompanied their continued management. Etienne understood that Rienzi was no ordinary estate. It was a place imbued with forces that could not be ignored, a site of both extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary danger. Unlike his cousin, he approached the problem with a combination of caution, calculation, and an acute awareness that ignoring the spiritual dimension could prove catastrophic. Etienne's observations were meticulous. He noted the clay in Beaumont's mouth, the marks on his wrists and ankles, the broken mirrors, the frost and ice despite the mild winter, all details that suggested intervention by forces beyond human comprehension. Yet he also recognized the necessity of maintaining order. The plantation could not function if the enslaved population lost faith in their security, or if rumors of supernatural wrath spread unchecked. Etienne had to strike a balance, acknowledging the extraordinary events without inciting panic or rebellion, leveraging the twins' influence while asserting his authority as master. The complexity of his task revealed the subtle interplay between fear, power, and survival in a society built upon oppression. Meanwhile, Selah and Miriam, known now as Selah and Miriam, occupied a precarious yet powerful position. Their role in Beaumont's death had elevated them to near-mythical status among the enslaved, yet it also placed them under constant scrutiny. Other enslaved people looked to them for protection, guidance, and spiritual counsel, while white authorities and neighboring planters watched closely, wary of their abilities and fearful of their potential influence. The twins became symbols of both liberation and caution. Within their community, they were revered as protectors, but they were also understood to be conduits for powers that could not be fully controlled or predicted. The discovery of Beaumont's death also prompted legal maneuvering. The confession found beside his body, a frantically scribbled testament of crimes that ranged from routine brutality to carefully orchestrated murders, posed a threat to the stability of Louisiana's plantation society. Local authorities, recognizing the destabilizing potential of this document, made the unprecedented decision to seal it. They would ensure that its contents influenced the disposition of the estate and the treatment of the enslaved population. But the public would never know the full extent of Claude Beaumont's atrocities. This decision reflected the fundamental contradiction of Southern society, the need to uphold the myth of benevolent slavery while privately acknowledging the violence necessary to maintain it. The immediate impact on the enslaved community was profound. Many viewed the twins' actions as evidence that resistance, spiritual or otherwise, could yield concrete results. Their courage and power inspired others, planting seeds for future acts of defiance. Yet older members of the community, those who remembered failed uprisings and the brutal suppression that followed, counseled caution. They understood that visible acts of defiance could provoke devastating reprisals. The twins' careful navigation of these dangers, their ability to wield spiritual power without prompting widespread retaliation, demonstrated the intricate balance required for effective resistance in a system designed to crush agency. By the time Etienne settled into his role as the new master of Rienzi, the plantation had already transformed. The reputation of the estate as a site of supernatural activity persisted, influencing both the behavior of the enslaved and the perceptions of white planters across Louisiana. Selah and Miriam, freed under Etienne's arrangements, began to establish their spiritual practice openly. Their work, both protective and healing, extended beyond the bounds of Rienzi, providing guidance to enslaved and free people of color throughout the river parishes. The twins' ability to blend spiritual authority with practical leadership created a new model for empowerment, one that demonstrated that resistance could coexist with survival, that agency could be exercised even under the watchful eyes of oppressors. In the aftermath, Rienzi became a focal point of legend and speculation. Stories of Beaumont's death and the twins' power circulated widely, fueling fear among planters and fascination among the enslaved. The event set a precedent, illustrating that spiritual intervention could achieve justice where earthly systems failed. The twins' actions rippled outward, influencing broader discussions about resistance, authority, and the limits of power in a society structured around the oppression of human beings. Their legacy, though immediate in its effects, would extend far beyond the plantation, contributing to the evolution of spiritual resistance practices and reshaping the consciousness of both enslaved communities and the white society that sought to control them. When Etienne Beaumont arrived at Rienzi, I could feel the tension in the air shift almost immediately. Unlike his cousin Claude, whose cruelty had been infamous even among the white community, Etienne carried himself with a calm precision that concealed the sharp calculation beneath. From the moment he stepped off the riverboat, accompanied by a retinue of lawyers, accountants, and spiritual advisors, it was clear that Rienzi would no longer be a plantation governed by brute fear alone. There was purpose in his movements, a deliberate approach that suggested both caution and opportunity. He walked the grounds, observing the quarters, the fields, and most notably, the cypress grove where Selah and Miriam, known now as Selah and Miriam, had conducted their rituals. His eyes, though steady, betrayed the faintest flicker of unease. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that Rienzi was not just a plantation. It was a site infused with power he could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The first meeting took place in the old parlor, a room that had once echoed with Claude's commands and terrorized whispers. Etienne called together his advisors, both white and black, free and enslaved, to discuss the immediate challenges of managing the estate. The conversation was careful, meticulous and measured, but the underlying truth was undeniable. Rienzi could not be run as it had been. The spirits had acted decisively against Claude, and any attempt to revert to the old methods risked repeating his fate. Etienne recognized that the labor force, nearly 500 strong, required more than discipline. It required a new framework, one that acknowledged the reality of supernatural influence while preserving the plantation's economic viability. It was in this context that the twins were summoned. Selah and Miriam, their reputations cemented by the events of the previous weeks, stood before Etienne with a mixture of reverence, wariness, and quiet authority. They were not merely petitioners, they were stakeholders whose influence could determine the plantation's future. The room seemed to shift around them, as though their presence carried a weight that extended beyond the physical. Etienne, recognizing both their power and their danger, approached them not as an oppressor, but as a negotiator. The discussion was delicate, a balancing act between acknowledging their supernatural authority and asserting the legal and economic parameters of his inheritance. The twins presented their conditions with clarity and precision. Immediate manumission was non-negotiable, they insisted, for themselves and for those who had directly participated in their spiritual workings. Yet they were acutely aware that full emancipation for the entire enslaved population could provoke violent backlash, destabilize the estate, and draw attention from authorities across the river parishes. They proposed instead a hybrid system, wage labor combined with gradual manumission for those who demonstrated loyalty, productivity, and a commitment to maintaining the plantation's prosperity. It was a plan that reflected both pragmatic wisdom and a deep understanding of the social dynamics at play. They were not seeking freedom at the expense of the community. They were seeking a framework that could benefit all, while ensuring their own protection and influence remained intact. Etienne listened, absorbing every word. He recognized the brilliance of their proposal. It allowed him to maintain the estate's productivity, mitigated the risks posed by potential rebellion, and leveraged the twins' unique abilities to protect Rienzi from future supernatural threats. The negotiations were painstaking, extending over several days, but a consensus emerged. Selah and Miriam would remain on the plantation as free women, granted the autonomy to establish a spiritual practice that served both enslaved and free communities. In return, they would use their abilities to guard the estate against rival practitioners, provide counsel to those seeking protection or justice, and act as intermediaries between the supernatural and the physical realms. The agreement, though unprecedented, was accepted by all parties. It was a testament to the evolving understanding of power, authority, and survival in a world where conventional hierarchies were no longer sufficient to guarantee control. Following the agreement, the twins began the careful work of reorganizing their surroundings. A building was constructed specifically for their practice, designed according to African architectural principles that maximized the flow of spiritual energy while providing protection against hostile forces. Every detail, from the placement of doors and windows to the alignment of rooms with celestial bodies, was intentional. The space became both a sanctuary and a center for community empowerment, a place where the enslaved and free could seek guidance, protection, and healing. Within its walls, the rituals that had once been clandestine were now performed openly, though with discretion and care, ensuring that their influence remained potent yet difficult to trace for those who might oppose them. The impact of this transformation extended quickly beyond the physical boundaries of Rienzi. Word spread through the river parishes of a plantation where justice, protection, and spiritual empowerment were not only possible but actively practiced. Enslaved people from nearby estates sought counsel, protection, or healing, arriving with a mixture of hope and fear. Free people of color, navigating the precarious social hierarchies of antebellum Louisiana, also came seeking assistance, recognizing that the twins' influence could offer both tangible and spiritual benefits. Even white women, particularly those trapped in abusive households, learned to seek guidance through intermediaries, carefully navigating social and legal constraints to access the twins' power. Selah and Miriam's practice thus became a unique intersection where the rigid hierarchies of Southern society could be temporarily suspended and where spiritual authority transcended conventional categories of race, class, and status. Etienne's role in this transformation was equally critical. By acknowledging the twins' autonomy and abilities, he effectively ensured the continued stability and profitability of Rienzi while mitigating the risk of supernatural or social upheaval. His approach reflected both business acumen and an understanding of the profound changes the twins' actions had introduced. Rather than attempting to suppress or exploit their power, he integrated it into the management of the plantation, creating a model that allowed for controlled agency among the formerly oppressed. This hybrid system, though far from ideal freedom, represented a pragmatic evolution in the labor relations of the region, a recognition that the conventional methods of control, rooted in fear and violence, were no longer sufficient when confronted with extraordinary resistance. The twins' negotiation also reflected their deep strategic thinking and commitment to their community. They understood that their individual freedom, while necessary, was meaningless if it came at the cost of abandoning those without their supernatural abilities. Their plan allowed for incremental manumission, protection for the vulnerable, and a framework that could serve as a model for other estates. By negotiating not only for themselves but for the broader community, they transformed Rienzi into a locus of empowerment and a symbol of resistance that extended well beyond the plantation itself. The physical and spiritual infrastructure they built reinforced this new paradigm. The carefully designed building, aligned to maximize ancestral energy, served as both a protective bastion and a visible statement of the new order. Every ritual, consultation, and act of intervention was an assertion that the enslaved and free people of color at Rienzi had agency, that they could claim power and protection through spiritual means, and that their actions could influence events in the wider world. This transformation was not merely symbolic, it had tangible effects on daily life, altering the rhythms of work, the expectations of authority, and the perception of what was possible for those previously bound by fear and oppression. Through their negotiations and the establishment of a formal practice, Selah and Miriam carved out a space where justice could be meted out beyond the reach of human courts, where healing could occur for those who had suffered under the tyranny of masters like Claude Beaumont, and where the community could begin to imagine a future in which power was not solely concentrated in the hands of oppressors. Their success at Rienzi became a model for integrating spiritual authority with practical governance, demonstrating that resistance could be both strategic and sustainable, that power could be exercised responsibly, and that the legacies of oppression could be confronted through careful, deliberate action. In the weeks that followed, the plantation settled into a new rhythm. Fields were worked with cooperation rather than fear. The twins' presence as spiritual protectors infused the labor force with a quiet confidence, while Etienne's pragmatic oversight ensured economic continuity. Word of Rienzi's transformation spread, reaching distant parishes and planting seeds of possibility in the minds of those who had long believed themselves powerless. The plantation had been reshaped, not merely in terms of ownership or labor practices, but in the very perception of what could be achieved when courage, intelligence, and spiritual authority were wielded with precision and purpose. The months after our agreement with Etienne Beaumont felt like a new dawn, though the weight of the past lingered in every corner of Rienzi. Selah and I, Miriam, took to our roles with a mixture of reverence and practicality, understanding that the power we had wielded against Claude Beaumont was only the beginning. Every day, we constructed not only the physical structure of our spiritual center, but also the intangible architecture of trust, protection, and authority that would allow the enslaved and free alike to feel safe enough to approach us. The building itself became a manifestation of our intentions. Walls aligned to maximize the flow of ancestral energy, windows positioned to let in specific shafts of sunlight, and interior spaces arranged to amplify both spiritual and psychological presence. Every element of the structure spoke to our dedication, signaling to the community that Rienzi was now a place where justice, healing, and spiritual empowerment converged. From the first morning we opened the center, people began arriving. At first, it was the enslaved from our own plantation, those whose lives had been directly impacted by Claude's reign of terror. Their eyes were wary, scanning the room for signs of trickery or deceit. We welcomed them gently, never forcing our presence upon them, but letting our work and reputation speak for itself. Each consultation was an exercise in subtle instruction and protective empowerment. We guided them through rituals that allowed them to reclaim personal agency, teaching gestures, prayers, and chants that had survived transatlantic passage and generations of suppression. They learned to understand the invisible threads that connected them to their ancestors, the way spiritual energy could flow through physical objects, gestures, and the spoken word. Every visit reinforced their sense of identity and resilience, showing them that they were not merely subjects to be owned, but individuals capable of influencing their own destinies. Word spread quickly. By midsummer, people from neighboring plantations began to seek our counsel. Free people of color, whose legal standing remained precarious, came to us in search of protection from the increasingly complex social hierarchies that governed their lives. They brought questions about property, legal disputes, and family safety, knowing that our methods could address threats invisible to conventional law. Even some white families, particularly women trapped in domestic situations of abuse or social constraint, approached intermediaries to request protection, guidance, or intervention. It was a delicate balance. Our work had to remain accessible to those in need, without drawing undue attention from authorities who might perceive our growing influence as a threat. Every consultation, every act of intervention was carefully considered, ensuring that the outcomes reinforced the spiritual and social stability of our expanding network. One of the first significant challenges involved mediating disputes among the enslaved community itself. Not all were immediately trusting of our intentions. Old grievances, rivalries, and fear of reprisal still shaped interactions. We established a system of rituals and spiritual arbitration where grievances could be aired safely and resolutions guided by both ancestral insight and practical wisdom. People learned to recognize the authority of the spiritual world without dismissing the realities of plantation life. We became not just protectors and healers, but mediators, showing that justice could be administered beyond the narrow confines of human law. The rituals themselves were carefully choreographed, blending African traditions with adaptations suited to the social and environmental realities of Louisiana. Dance, chant, and offerings were combined with psychological strategies to reinforce confidence and reduce fear, creating ceremonies that were as empowering as they were protective. By the end of the first year, our reputation had grown far beyond Rienzi. River parishes from Point Coupé to Baton Rouge whispered of the twins at Rienzi, who had brought down a master with forces beyond human comprehension. These stories were amplified by word of mouth, weaving together awe, respect, and fear. Other enslaved people began attempting minor forms of spiritual resistance, though few could match the depth, precision, or intensity of our work. Our presence became a stabilizing force, a visible and invisible shield against both human and supernatural threats. We maintained a strict code, ensuring that our interventions served protective and restorative purposes rather than personal vengeance, reinforcing the ethical foundation that guided our growing influence. The spiritual services we provided were diverse. Healing rituals became a cornerstone of our practice, addressing both physical ailments and emotional trauma. We worked with people suffering from injuries, chronic illness, and the lingering psychological scars of abuse, using a combination of herbal remedies, focused prayers, and ritualized energy work. At the same time, we offered guidance in matters of social and economic negotiation. For enslaved people, this could mean strategic planning to avoid punishments or manage labor expectations. For free people of color, it involved advice on property disputes, financial planning, and navigating legal complexities. Each intervention was conducted with precision and foresight, ensuring that every action reinforced both individual safety and the collective well-being of the community. Our influence extended into psychological warfare, a skill honed during the months leading up to Claude Beaumont's demise. While the masters and overseers of neighboring plantations could not directly interfere with us, their actions often carried indirect consequences. We developed methods to subtly influence their behavior, drawing upon ancestral knowledge of human perception and vulnerability. These methods were never intended to cause harm arbitrarily. They were calculated to prevent violence, protect the community, and reinforce the inevitability of justice for those who sought to maintain control through cruelty. The boundaries between spiritual guidance, empowerment, and intervention were carefully maintained, ensuring that our actions remained ethically grounded, even as they exerted undeniable influence over the broader social landscape. Education also became a crucial aspect of our work. Selah and I began teaching apprentices enslaved and free individuals who demonstrated aptitude and interest in spiritual practice. These lessons were rigorous and disciplined, combining ritual instruction with historical context, practical applications, and ethical considerations. Each apprentice became a conduit for knowledge, spreading our teachings further into the river parishes and strengthening a network of spiritually empowered individuals. Our goal was not simply to build followers, but to cultivate a system of protection and agency that could outlast our personal involvement, ensuring that the gains we had achieved would continue to benefit future generations. The ripple effects of our work were felt in subtle, systemic ways. Plantation owners, aware of Rienzi's reputation, began to alter their practices, sometimes instituting minor reforms to prevent unrest, other times reinforcing oppressive measures in fear of supernatural retaliation. News of our interventions created a climate of uncertainty among the elite, reminding them that power was not absolute, and that even the most entrenched hierarchies could be challenged through spiritual and intellectual ingenuity. Enslaved communities across Louisiana, inspired by our example, experimented with their own forms of resistance, blending traditional practices with innovative adaptations suited to their unique circumstances. Our work at Rienzi became a template for community-based spiritual resistance, demonstrating that agency could be reclaimed even under the harshest conditions. As our reputation grew, we also became custodians of history and memory. Every consultation, ritual, and intervention was recorded in oral and written traditions, ensuring that the stories of suffering, resistance, and triumph would endure. These narratives reinforced communal identity and resilience, reminding each person that their ancestors' wisdom and guidance remained accessible. The Cypress Grove, once a site of clandestine rituals, now served as a sacred space for reflection, teaching, and ceremonial gatherings. It became a symbol of continuity, connecting past struggles to present empowerment and reminding all who entered that spiritual authority and ancestral guidance were inseparable from the fight for justice. By the second year, Rienzi was no longer simply a plantation. It had become a spiritual and social hub, a place where the lines between enslaved, free, black, and white were temporarily suspended in recognition of ancestral power. Our work demonstrated that structured, ethical spiritual practice could coexist with pragmatic considerations of survival and social stability. The twins had not only survived the horrors of Claude Beaumont's reign, but had transformed the very framework of labor, protection, and resistance in their corner of Louisiana. Communities that once felt powerless now understood that they could exercise agency in ways that were invisible to those who sought to dominate them, and that ancestral wisdom could be a force as formidable as any human weapon or legal authority. Through our efforts, Rienzi became a model for spiritual, social, and practical empowerment, a testament to the resilience of the oppressed, the potency of ancestral knowledge, and the enduring impact of carefully wielded spiritual authority. The expansion of our influence ensured that our work would resonate far beyond the boundaries of the plantation, setting the stage for generations of spiritual resistance, communal empowerment, and the persistent assertion of agency in a world designed to suppress it. The growing reputation of Selah and myself brought not only reverence and gratitude, but also a shadow that followed closely behind, the weight of ethical responsibility. With every consultation, every ritual performed for protection or justice, the boundaries of our power became clearer, and the potential for misuse hovered like a storm cloud over our work. It was one thing to harness the ancestral energies for the protection of our own community at Rienzi. It was another to wield that same force in ways that could inadvertently harm others. Each invocation, each chant that summoned the spirits to our aid, demanded exact precision. Missteps could have consequences both physical and spiritual. I learned quickly that power without restraint could be as destructive to us as to those we sought to protect. From the earliest months of our expansion, we faced situations that tested the limits of our ethical compass. One afternoon, a young enslaved woman arrived at the center, tears streaking her soot-darkened cheeks. Her master had attempted to sell her younger brother to settle debts, separating the family entirely. She begged for intervention, hoping that our ancestral connections could avert this cruel transaction. Selah and I could feel the intense sorrow and desperation radiating from her, the ancestral threads of her lineage intertwined with the collective suffering of countless generations. We knew that if we acted with sheer force against the master, it would guarantee retribution from the broader community of plantation owners, risking countless lives. We were caught between the immediate human desire for justice and the long-term consequences of unchecked spiritual action. This was a lesson that repeated itself often. Our powers, while formidable, existed within a web of cause and effect that extended beyond the walls of Rienzi. Every intervention carried a potential backlash, a ripple effect that could strike those we had no direct intention of harming. There were times when the spirits themselves reminded us of these limits, their voices rising in harmony and dissonance alike, warning that cosmic justice required balance, and that anger alone could not dictate our actions. Selah and I had to refine our approach, balancing the emotional immediacy of human suffering with the rational, strategic understanding that preserving life, hope, and stability for as many as possible was the truest form of justice. Rival spiritual practitioners also began to take notice of our growing influence, and not all approached with goodwill. Some saw Rienzi as an opportunity to consolidate power, seeking to co-opt our techniques or challenge us directly through displays of spiritual might. These confrontations were subtle at first, whispers on the wind, displaced objects, sudden chills that unsettled our rituals. Over time, the confrontations grew more tangible, rival practitioners attempting to disrupt our ceremonies with ill-intentioned invocations, challenging the authority of the ancestral spirits we had aligned with over generations. Selah and I learned to defend against such threats, channeling protective forces around the grove, reinforcing the sacred boundaries that allowed our work to continue uninterrupted. These rivalries tested not only our skill but our judgment, to repel aggression without crossing into vengeance that might compromise our ethical stance. One of the most difficult encounters involved a group of practitioners from a neighboring parish who had been exploiting enslaved communities under the guise of spiritual guidance. They arrived at Rienzi under the pretense of requesting collaboration, but intended to manipulate the twins' powers for personal gain. Selah and I immediately sensed the deception. The moment their energy entered the grove, the air thickened with tension, and the spirits of our ancestors stirred uneasily. We confronted them in ritual, their words and gestures clashing against ours in a complex interplay of spiritual force. The battle was not one of destruction, but of negotiation, of asserting moral authority, of demonstrating that the ancestral power we wielded could be employed only for protection and empowerment, not exploitation. The rival practitioners departed, chastened and wary, understanding that at Rienzi, spiritual authority was inseparable from ethical responsibility. Ethical dilemmas also arose internally, within the community we protected. Not everyone agreed with the choices Selah and I made, even when guided by ancestral wisdom. Some argued for immediate, aggressive intervention against masters who had committed acts of cruelty, believing that spiritual justice demanded retribution without delay. Others feared the potential consequences of such actions, worried that any manifestation of supernatural power could provoke violent retaliation against all enslaved people in the region. We held council with our apprentices and community members, guiding discussions that weighed the needs of the present against the broader imperative of survival and long-term liberation. Decisions were made collectively when possible, always under the watchful guidance of the ancestral spirits, whose presence reminded us that justice was never simplistic and power never absolute. As our reputation solidified, the complexity of our work deepened. We were not merely healers or protectors. We had become arbiters of justice, mediators of disputes, and keepers of sacred knowledge. Every interaction carried the weight of history. Every choice rippled outward with consequences that could span generations. The twins' fame spread not merely through acts of power, but through acts of discretion, subtle intervention, and unwavering ethical conduct. Each decision was a dance, a precise calibration of intention, action, and consequence, guided by ancestral insight and lived experience. We also encountered situations where spiritual guidance and human law collided. One case involved a planter accused of abusing his enslaved laborers. His family attempted to pursue legal recourse, but the plantation courts were predictable in their bias, dismissing the plight of the enslaved as irrelevant to property interests. Selah and I advised the affected community members on ways to navigate the law while employing protective rituals that prevented further harm. We walked a fine line, using spiritual influence to safeguard lives without provoking the authorities unnecessarily. The lessons here were profound. Ethical power was as much about restraint as action, about preserving life and dignity as much as exacting justice. Despite these challenges, the twins' influence expanded, not merely through acts of protection but through education and mentorship. We taught apprentices not only the rituals themselves, but the principles behind them: discernment, ethical judgment, and the understanding that ancestral power was not a tool for personal gain, but a responsibility carried across generations. Apprentices learned to read subtle energies, recognize the motives of those who sought intervention, and weigh immediate outcomes against long-term consequences. Each lesson reinforced the understanding that ethical practice was inseparable from spiritual competence, and that true power was measured not in fear imposed, but in life preserved and justice upheld. The ethical complexities of our work manifested most sharply during periods of communal crisis. Disease, harsh labor, and environmental hazards were constants on the plantation and throughout the surrounding parishes. While we could offer spiritual and herbal support, we had to navigate carefully, ensuring that interventions were both effective and sustainable. Each act of guidance or protection required consultation with the ancestors, reflection upon historical precedent, and consideration of potential backlash. The responsibility weighed heavily. Every decision could save lives or, if miscalculated, imperil them. Selah and I became acutely aware that leadership in spiritual practice demanded an unbroken commitment to foresight, empathy, and integrity. Our growing authority also attracted scrutiny from external forces, both secular and spiritual. Some white authorities suspected that our activities extended beyond healing, fearing that the twins' influence could incite rebellion. Others, curious or opportunistic, attempted to learn from us, sometimes requesting favors that we could not ethically grant. Maintaining balance required constant vigilance. Every ritual, every consultation had to be calculated to protect our community while upholding the principles we had vowed to follow. Through these trials, Selah and I understood that ethical power was inseparable from discipline. The ability to act decisively while restraining impulse, to assert authority while preserving life, and to employ spiritual force with wisdom rather than ego. By the end of this period, Rienzi had transformed into a hub of spiritual resistance and ethical practice. Selah and I had demonstrated that power, when tempered by responsibility and guided by ancestral wisdom, could achieve protection, justice, and empowerment without succumbing to vengeance or exploitation. The apprentices we trained carried forward these principles, ensuring that the twin legacy would endure in both influence and integrity. In confronting rival practitioners, ethical dilemmas, and the unpredictable consequences of spiritual intervention, we forged a model for resistance rooted not only in power but in wisdom, restraint, and a profound commitment to justice. Rienzi had become more than a plantation or a spiritual center. It had become a living testament to the possibility of wielding extraordinary power with conscience, vision, and responsibility. The consequences of our actions at Rienzi rippled far beyond the boundaries of the plantation, touching communities and power structures that had long believed themselves untouchable. From the moment Claude Beaumont fell under the weight of supernatural justice, the story spread through the river parishes like wildfire, carried by whispers in the fields, notes passed in secret, and cautious murmurs among both the enslaved and free people of color. The impact was immediate and tangible. Masters grew wary, overseers more hesitant, and even the most hardened planters began reconsidering the assumptions they had held about control and obedience. Selah and I quickly realized that our work was no longer confined to protection or localized justice. It had become a catalyst for social unrest and political upheaval, the consequences of which could neither be measured nor contained easily. The white planter class responded in ways both calculated and desperate. Within weeks, the network of river parishes convened informal councils, their members anxious to ascertain whether Rienzi's events were an isolated anomaly or a sign of a growing threat. Rumors of supernatural power wielded by enslaved people challenged the very foundations upon which their society was built. In private, many admitted that the old reliance on brute force, terror, and legal enforcement could no longer guarantee absolute control. Publicly, however, they doubled down, passing new ordinances that criminalized possession of certain herbs, minerals, or ritual objects, while offering bounties for information leading to the identification of unauthorized spiritual practitioners. These measures, framed as safeguards for public order, were in reality the legal codification of fear, a desperate attempt to reassert dominance in the face of an emergent force they could neither see nor fully understand. Within the enslaved community, the consequences of our actions were equally complex. Selah and I were treated with awe, gratitude, and cautious fear. Many viewed our interventions as liberatory, proof that ancestral knowledge and spiritual discipline could achieve what the courts and human institutions had repeatedly denied. Others, particularly elders who had lived through failed rebellions and violent crackdowns, approached us with skepticism. They understood that acts of supernatural resistance could provoke brutal retaliation, potentially endangering entire plantations and neighboring communities. Our counsel became sought after not only for protection, but for guidance in navigating the fine line between resistance and survival. Every decision carried the weight of communal welfare, forcing us to consider consequences not merely in the moment, but in the long arc of the lives we were entrusted to safeguard. Etienne Beaumont, our new overseer turned owner, proved instrumental in shaping the political landscape that emerged in the aftermath of Claude's death. Unlike his cousin, Etienne was pragmatic, able to reconcile the economic necessity of managing a plantation with the extraordinary circumstances Rienzi now embodied. He recognized that our supernatural abilities, while a threat in the abstract, could also serve as a stabilizing force if respected and integrated strategically. Under his guidance, Rienzi became a model of controlled adaptation, a plantation operating under a hybrid system that balanced labor expectations with the provision of spiritual autonomy, allowing Selah and me to maintain authority over the spiritual affairs of the enslaved community without outright challenging Etienne's legal ownership. The delicate equilibrium we established was revolutionary. It demonstrated to other planters that spiritual intervention need not result in catastrophic upheaval if navigated wisely, while simultaneously establishing the twins' role as figures whose influence could not be ignored or undermined. The broader societal ramifications extended beyond the confines of Rienzi. News of the twins' intervention and Claude Beaumont's death reached neighboring parishes, drawing both fascination and alarm. Abolitionist writers and northern newspapers seized upon the story as evidence that enslaved people possessed agency, resilience, and spiritual power that bondage could not suppress. These accounts were used to argue, with growing force, that the institution of slavery was not only morally corrupt but increasingly unsustainable in the face of resistance that transcended the physical realm. Pro-slavery advocates, conversely, cited Rienzi as proof of the necessity for tighter control, surveillance, and the suppression of African spiritual practices. The story of Rienzi became a symbol, a Rorschach test, onto which various factions projected their fears, hopes, and ideological convictions. Selah and I understood that our actions were no longer private interventions, but public catalysts, shaping discourse and influencing policy in ways we had neither sought nor fully anticipated. In response to the perceived threat of supernatural resistance, white authorities instituted a network of spiritual advisors, primarily ministers and self-styled experts in African religions, whose primary function was to provide planters with methods for neutralizing perceived threats. These advisors traveled widely, instructing planters in counter-magic, protective charms, and ritualized deterrence. Our fame, paradoxically, strengthened their influence. The more effective our work appeared, the more desperate the white planter class became to protect itself. Yet despite these efforts, the widespread fear of spiritual reprisal forced subtle changes in planter behavior. Masters were less willing to employ overt violence. Overseers became cautious in their enforcement, and the previously rigid hierarchies of plantation life were punctuated by moments of negotiation, subtle resistance, and quiet defiance that reflected the growing understanding that enslaved people could exert influence beyond mere physical labor. The twins' influence also catalyzed new forms of community organization among the enslaved. Knowledge of spiritual practice spread cautiously but persistently, creating networks of practitioners and apprentices who exchanged information, herbs, and protective techniques. These networks, operating under the radar of white authorities, allowed for a degree of collective agency previously unimaginable in the rigidly stratified plantation society. Selah and I were careful to guide this growth, teaching apprentices not only the mechanics of ritual, but the ethics that governed its use. We emphasized discernment, responsibility, and the principle that power existed to protect and preserve, not to exploit or exact revenge indiscriminately. This emphasis ensured that spiritual empowerment became a stabilizing force rather than a catalyst for reckless violence, and that the legacy of Rienzi would endure through generations as a model of disciplined resistance. The legal and economic ramifications were no less profound. The confession Claude had left behind, though sealed by authorities, shaped the handling of his estate and the status of the nearly 500 enslaved people at Rienzi. Etienne Beaumont's management approach, a blend of pragmatism and respect for the twins' authority, set a precedent that other plantation owners could neither ignore nor replicate without encountering resistance. The hybrid labor system, combining wage labor with gradual manumission for those demonstrating productivity and loyalty, reflected a tacit acknowledgement that the previous model of absolute control was no longer tenable. While far from full freedom, this system represented a significant shift in the social and economic architecture of plantation life, illustrating the broader influence of the twins' work in shaping labor relations, even among those who had once wielded unquestioned power. Yet the social ramifications extended beyond plantation labor. The visibility of spiritual resistance forced conversations across the spectrum of Louisiana society. Free people of color, previously marginalized and constrained by social and legal restrictions, recognized that spiritual authority could confer tangible protection, influence, and agency. Communities began organizing around spiritual networks, blending traditional African practices with local adaptations to create systems of mutual support and protection. Even white authorities were forced to reckon with these dynamics, balancing repression with cautious recognition of the twins' power. Selah and I became central figures in this evolving social ecosystem, not as rulers but as mediators, educators, and symbols of what disciplined spiritual authority could achieve. Finally, the ripple effects of our work intersected with the broader political tensions building across the South. The demonstration that enslaved people could exercise agency in ways invisible to conventional power structures challenged assumptions that the planter class relied upon to maintain control. Abolitionists in the North seized upon our story, portraying it as evidence that enslaved people were capable of moral, intellectual, and spiritual leadership that defied the paternalistic justifications of slavery. Southern authorities, in turn, amplified narratives of threat, justifying harsher laws and surveillance measures. Rienzi thus became a fulcrum point, a site where the dynamics of oppression, resistance, spirituality, and politics converged in ways that would reverberate through the decade leading to the Civil War. Through it all, Selah and I maintained focus on our core mission: protection, justice, and the ethical stewardship of ancestral power. The political and social ramifications were real, far-reaching, and often unpredictable, yet we recognized that our influence could be a force for stability, education, and empowerment if wielded with care. Rienzi became both sanctuary and school, a space where spiritual resistance could coexist with practical governance, where the exercise of power was inseparable from moral accountability, and where the lessons of the past informed strategies for both survival and societal transformation. The political, social, and cultural impact of our work at Rienzi would not only alter the lives of those within the plantation's boundaries but set precedents and provide inspiration for generations of resistance and empowerment across Louisiana and beyond. If this story of courage, cosmic justice, and spiritual power moved you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of America's Hidden History. Comment below to share your thoughts or tell us which untold stories of resistance and empowerment you want us to explore next. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like and share it with friends who love powerful, untold history as much as you do.